host of state and Commonwealth education-related committees and reviews, and he's going to talk about one of those reviews this afternoon. So, welcome, Kwong.
Good. Thank you very much, Sally, and can I thank Brian and Cynthia for inviting me this afternoon. I've been interested in the quirks of compliance and the quest for quality for a long time, and I mention a couple of things simply to make the point that where we are at the moment, and as we look forward to where we're trending and likely to move in the next short period, that we are nevertheless part of and have absorbed and keep working within frameworks that have been earlier set. So I actually was chairing a Victorian state accrediting authority for former teachers' colleges back in 1974, and from the early 1990s I had more than a decade on the Hong Kong Council for Academic Accreditation. When I left there, I'd been the longest serving member on that council, and I've also been involved with the first 3 rounds or cycles of audits in New Zealand, so Waikato and Otago, and more recently Vic University Wellington. Now, I'm part of that accrediting, auditing community, and you know, it is a community. It's got its own arcane and specialist language. We talk about output, we talk about outcome, we talk about learning outcomes. Assessment has a lot of loaded meanings: development, attainment, retention, credit transfer, RPL. All those things are still with us. And we can sometimes overuse the word quality so that we drain it of any real meaning for those that are outside this insider cognoscenti group. In our own institutions, we're recognised sometimes as people that hover within particular committees of faculties and departments and specific committees of academic boards. There are not only the academics who find that they can build a career making progression through this sort of route, there's also professional staff. And those from the institutions are continually interacting with counterparts in the various accrediting and audit bodies, passing documents both ways, revising and reworking them and elaborating. And it culminates in the binding of these compilations, huge documents with pristine covers that are there to present to governing councils of institutions and to the authority of decision makers established through legislation. And for much of the rest of the academic community, there's a sense of mild suspicion, and there's a touch of wonder at why people spend their time doing all this. And I'm making the point because I think that we need, those of us that are in this world, need to be cautious in thinking that what we should be doing is trying to get everyone in our institutions, all our academic community, to come on board and join this. I think a number of people, including senior people, have felt that it's been in their interests to keep their heads down, get on with their research and go to international conferences. And if we say, well, am I recalling a nostalgic past? I think if you look at the detail in the threshold standards and you turn up the course accreditation requirements, you'll find things that look hauntingly familiar. So what's new is that in moving from a big focus on words like accreditation and words like audit to the word regulation, is that we've broadened the context. We've picked up more explicitly a panoply of governance and management issues, the anxiety about financial and related risks. A lot of the things that have been bequeathed to communities by the MBA people around the world. If you take a word like frameworks, and I'm thinking of both an AQF, a national quality framework, or think of standards frameworks, the things that Richard James was talking about. There's a guy, Mike Coles, who was writing a lot about European approaches to qualification frameworks at a national and Europe-wide level. And he said, I have to admit that these are essentially bureaucratic structures. And then he said, the only argument for the existence of these frameworks is that they add value to the learning that takes place in schools, colleges, universities, workplaces, and in everyday life. The way these frameworks, I'm quoting, the way these frameworks can add value is by broadening the appreciation of the learning and enabling recognition beyond the place of learning to other places and to other stakeholders who are not directly involved in the learning process. And still quoting, he says, in other words, they offer increased status to learning and qualifications through the explanatory power of the framework and its levels. I actually think that's pretty spot on. Most of us, I noticed in this recent UK Higher Education Commission report on regulating higher education, they have a set of 3 or 4 objectives, purposes, which are really explaining the justifying the existence of these regulatory bodies. And one of them is about wider recognition, international standing. I actually think it's the core one, because when you say, we're there really to protect students, I can't help feeling that we mustn't take away from the institutions themselves and the component parts of the institutions where the teaching and learning is actually occurring day by day. That is where students should be protected primarily. Okay to be monitoring at a wider level. In an earlier era here in this country at a state level, now I think rightly at a national level. Good to be doing those things, but that we mustn't do anything that detracts from the people at the coalface and within the institutions and with responsibilities for academic boards and governing councils of institutions. That is where the buck should really lie and largely stop. Let me link what I've been saying with the first major conclusion of our report, and the first thing that Greg Craven said this morning is that, I quote from the report, TEQSA plays an important national and international role in asserting and maintaining the equality in the Australian higher education system. It needs to be retained. We said it was far too early to be contemplating restructures, the idea of merging with ASQA, perhaps rolling everything into the department, or creating, as Greg Craven mentioned again this morning, a not yet widely considered universities commission, and that won't cope with all of higher education, as Claire's just reminded us. Though we did add that we gave serious thought to all of those possibilities because of, at the time, the depth and the spread of the unease with Texas activities that we judge were being felt across the sector. Now that the incoming government has accepted all the report's recommendations, and that recommendation to retain TEXA is a component part of it, the government and TEXA, the agency, and a wide range of institutions need to work together on how we can rebuild the standing and the support for an entity that is in our national interest and for which there isn't yet an alternative put forward that has garnered wide support. And secondly, at the same time, we've got to seek two things. One is the kind of change in orientation that the report spoke of. Partnerships, not objects. Cooperation. Seeing the whole regulatory framework as not just one entity. We've got to seek to change that, and we've got to have this significant reduction in the scope and scale of activity. Remember that we said that TEXA, in a word, needs to become smaller and to have fewer functions. Now, within the legislative framework in which it is bound, TEXA itself has put forward proposals which, if adopted, do amount to a significant reduction in the scope and scale of its activities. There's one document, Future Directions for TEXA's Regulatory Processes. It sharpens the focus on re-registration, on course accreditation and re-accreditation. It reduces the evidence requirements, it reduces the amount of information required, and it seeks to work with providers to streamline and consolidate applications. And in the other document that they've also put out in October, Future Directions for Regulating Risk Framework, it's cut back from 46 risk indicators to 12. And I just say in passing, when I look at these 12 indicators, they do look remarkably like the performance indicators which were used in what were called profile processes back in the mid-1990s. Mike Gallagher was then presiding over these institutional profile meetings, and as a member of the Higher Education Council, I attended some of those meetings, and my sense that was felt at that time, and I still feel, is that whether you call these visits and meetings profiles, or whether you call them compacts, or whether you call them something else, whether the money hangs on the outcomes or whether money doesn't hang on the outcomes, the fact is that this is an opportunity where a national group with authority meets with the senior institutional members, and each side learns from the other and learns more than simply information. So we didn't then have the finer language of regulatory risk, but that's what it was about. Let me talk about diversity for a moment. What we all think is a good thing, and none of us want one size fits all. A focus on institutional visits and across-the-table dialogue is what leads to better appreciation of diversity, leads to an understanding of the differing aspirations and goals and priorities of one institution compared with another. It's easy to say we don't want a one-size-fits-all approach. We don't want to start with a blank slate. But that's a more likely outcome if we are doing things by written modes of communication from what for many in a big country like Australia is a distant national office. The same point actually has been made just this week or two back by the publication of this UK Higher Education Commission report. They say the same thing. The bonds that those state regulatory or accreditation bodies formed, particularly with the smaller institutions, are one of the downsides of moving to a single national regulating entity. I'm all for the national purview, and at this stage in our history, that is the right way to go. But let's not believe that there aren't negatives in going that way, and let's look to how you might ameliorate them. So I wouldn't start with worrying about the big universities. I'd start with the Perth Bible College, with Tabor College in Adelaide, its counterpart in Tasmania, the Wesley Institute in Sydney, and the larger Australian College of Theology with sites in all the mainland states. These small communities have been going since the 1920s, many of them, and they do feel that they are less understood now than in earlier times over that time of existence. They actually found, when they moved from the state to Auckland, that by the time the visits were actually taking place, not the big documents that had to be prepared first, when the visits were taking place, they felt people started to understand, and that was maybe just for the first couple of years of Texas existence that has been lost for a bit. So if we're going to embrace diversity, we've got to develop approaches that work for the diverse entities. Now, I don't want to be kind of making a cheap shot. I really don't. But isn't it a pity that in its first year, TEXA spent 6 to 9 months going to and fro between the institutional officers and the case managers of ANU and Monash and University Technology Sydney, and at the end of it, they said, you are able to be re-registered and to continue as an Australian university. Now, the idea of putting your time and energy where risk and issues matter most would suggest to me that, and I think TEXA acknowledges that now, and as I say, I really don't want to make a cheap shot, but I'm making a point that the effort needs to be recalibrated, to use, again, Greg Craven's word, as to where things pick up from now. But, you know, cheap shots are not the right way to go. And I did note that in last week's GO8 update, they list a series of what they call matters of particular interest to the GO8 at the moment. And the first of these, they put it this way: getting TEXA back on the rails and off the back of well-functioning universities. Now, okay, I can understand that and I can support it in many ways. It's what our report in a funny way was really doing. But maybe today, when the world has moved on, governments have changed, decisions are being made, maybe we don't need quite to use that language. I'm going to finish with 2 points. One, a comment on what, again, the insider cognoscenti call the regulatory architecture. And secondly, make a comment on this coming release of the new standards framework by the higher education panel that Richard James was speaking about this morning. On regulatory architecture, through its evolution, in which institutions and TEXA and the department are required to operate, it's quite complicated. It's not entirely consistent, and it does pose difficulties for everyone. But do guard against thinking that there are quick fixes to be had by hand-waving or simply deleting chunks of legislation. I actually believe, I'm quite confident, that we are on the verge of some major improvements, but it's going to require hard slog, a lot of sensitivity to the concerns and priorities of others, and trying to make decisions being conscious that it won't be easy to see some of the longer term consequences. So for some time, TEXA has been attempting to improve its alignment between its legislation and the ESOS Act in ways that ease the practical burdens on institutions. The wide ambit of ESOS, as we've heard already today, going into school education, language institutes, as well as tertiary programs, could be an inhibitor to some apparently desirable amendments. So that's TEXA and ESOS. TEXA and ASCA have already reached agreements which, to a degree, a real degree, reduce potential complexity for institutions that are operating in both spaces. And while some are immediately thinking of the dual sector universities, the 5 of them, and maybe soon another 1 or 2, maybe 6 now, as we've seen on Claire's slides and in other ways, there are lots of TAFEs that are offering higher education programs. There are many vet providers that are offering higher education programs, and there are many universities and other providers that are also RTOs. Now, I can't myself see at the moment, and our report said this, that it would be realistic to try to merge those 2 regulators, despite I listened carefully to what Bill Scales was saying, but I just don't myself think that the circumstances and the drivers are right for that. But it's certainly the case that all of us ought to be alert to the fact that if we look the other way, do nothing, then the way in which each regulator moves could actually increase the gap, the distance between them, and that wouldn't be a good thing. Parallels between standard setting, HESP and TEXA on the one hand, and the National Skills Standards Council, NSSC, and ASCA on the other. And one might say, well, is it important for consistency between the standard setters and the way where standards are set for ESOS evaluations? They're set really in the department and less formally. I think there's a lot of complexity around all this. A lot depends on to whom people are responsible. NSSC, to this body called Scotties, which is a ministerial council that picks up state territory and Commonwealth ministers, whereas higher education panel is responsible direct to the Commonwealth minister. There's no point now in getting into that complexity, but just to say it is a complicated story, and it's probably best for most of us to be taking one step at a time and fixing the more obvious things first. I was going to say more about the AQF, but I'll leave that. And finally, just make a point about the coming standards framework as Richard James was revealing to us this morning. Those who feel comfort with the earlier national protocols for higher education approval processes, which were the base of the existing threshold standards, won't feel the urgency felt by HESP to this root and branch rework of the standards. And just as TEXA has been asked to reduce its demands, to simplify, to shorten, I would say for very nearly all providers, I hope that the Higher Education Standards Panel will keep the elaboration of the framework that we saw draft in part today, keep these requirements to a minimum. See, it's one thing for HESP to consult the sector and come away feeling that there is pretty wide and good agreement. It's going to be another when the case managers of TEXA begin to interpret compliance requirements. And my anxiety is that the sector, especially smaller institutions, might in 12 months' time say to themselves, we're actually confronting a no less elaborate, no less detailed set of different requirements from the ones that we were coping with from 2012. In a red tape reducing environment, my advice would be to proceed with small and simple steps. If there's another furor breaking out, it wouldn't be a surprise if the mood of the moment is for disbanding rather than rectifying. As I read it, this is a moment for us all to proceed with modesty and with care. Thank you.
Can I kick off with a question? Because it's not a huge show of hands that I have to quieten down. I guess one of the things that comes through to me from your presentation and from Claire's is this kind of ethnographic view of culture, which is about it being based in the world that we live in. And you talked very briefly about what you thought the future might look like, and I wondered if you might take a minute to think about it from the broader political and cultural perspective of where the country is going, and whether you had any comments on how culture and quality assurance and regulation sat in the evolution of Australia.
Yes, well, culture, that's a good big one for, a 2-minute answer. Look, just think about what was implied in Bill Scales saying I don't think he used as strong a verb as abandon, but it came down to that. Let's abandon the targets. What the take-home message from me was, well, the participation target, I reckon we're well on the way to achieving. I've been saying that for some time, looking at the data as I read it from how things have been trending, and when you add in the international students and all the rest of it, I reckon we're getting there whether we keep the target or not. But we won't get the low SES target. And so Bill might be saying something which is realistic in the current Australian environment and saying, let's not keep hammering that. I can understand that position. I think that to actually achieve that, build that on the ground would be very difficult. Let me just give you a simple example. I like to go to concrete examples. Now, one of the things where TEXA was good, and we said so in the report, was the way they helped Monash and Ballarat transfer the Churchill Gippsland campus to the University of Ballarat. Now, the question now is for the new Federation University of Australia, where are they going to get these students from Gippsland that we haven't already got? And are there more students that we got from Ballarat? And so in a whole series of ways, the SES issues might already be Bill might be right, because he might simply be reflecting a state of reality. Just how we ought to be positioning ourselves for these things, I think is it's a complex, a difficult question. And my feeling is that there are a lot of responsible institutions, small private providers, larger private providers, for-profit providers included, that are going to be part of whatever solution emerges, much more than the universities of Melbourne, Sydney and Queensland are on that particular matter. And so what it comes down to for a regulatory body is that I think while the G08 can say, look, we're okay, get off our backs, we meet a lot of good things, and some other universities do as well, and Universities Australia rightly says we are speaking for all the universities of the country and we ought to be considered as a single entity. And Claire rightly, equally rightly, speaks of the commitment of her institutions, and Adrian McComb the same, and they work well. My sense is that when TEXA says, and when we generally say that we should, in looking at risk, be looking at the newer institutions and acknowledging the past history of the established places, that means all of these institutions. It doesn't just mean big universities that came from the 19th century. And I wouldn't want to make a divide and say universities here and other providers there. So, look, what I'm doing in sort of extemporising on that question is really trying to interpret it back to what actually is going to have to happen in the next few months in that wider context. And probably that's probably enough, by which time there'll be other people have some questions, Sally.
Over here,
Thank you very much for your talk, Peter McCallum from University of Sydney. I absolutely agree with your comment that it is the right time in our country to have a national or even possibly a more international approach than we sometimes have. And you framed your talk, I thought, very much in terms of, well, we were previously in a period which Texan more or less said was a strengthening of the regulatory framework, and now we're in a cutting red tape framework. And I just wonder if strengthening and shortening regulations is actually really always the best way to approach it, because it seems to me that by only focusing on risk, we've lost a few of the other noble goals of a national approach. And one of them that was articulated very passionately by the people involved in the AQF, but also by Denise Bradley, was the idea of portability of qualifications between sectors, between TAFE and university, between countries, and also accrediting a lot of training that went on more or less in a non-credentialised way within industries and so forth, very much to the detriment of the people who received that training, and then the company would go out of business and they would actually have nothing. So I wonder if this business of recalibrating regulation, does it also have to take part alongside repurposing it? Because there are many important reasons for doing this other than just avoiding risk. And I think the focus on risk has sometimes made the GO8, I agree, I come from a GO8 university, but I think they've been far too shrill in focusing on that side of things, rather than looking at the benefits we can get to spread more broadly.
Yes, I'd agree, and I'd take a lot of that as a statement. Peter, I suppose what I would say is I feel that we're actually in a globalised world in which I don't have anxiety that we won't be able to achieve those mutual recognitions of qualifications and qualifications recognised beyond our own shores and so forth. My sense is, I might be starry-eyed and maybe a bit out of touch. I hope I'm not. I think we're probably going further in that direction. I mean, it's interesting. University of Sydney is probably a good example of a university that will have a number of joint PhD candidates that will get a qualification from universities in two countries, from your university and from a partner university somewhere else, because that is one of the things that's happening. And just as that's happening at one level, I would have thought that it is probably easier in practice now to be able to take qualifications and credits and recognitions from one institution to another, crossing higher education boundaries and crossing institutional boundaries. I hope I'm right.
I need to say, Kwong, that your comments around equity and low SES was one of the reasons why we commissioned ACR to do the research and analysis for us. And a concluding part of their report is very similar to your sense of it, which is that if Australia wants to meet, that the participation target is more or less on track, and migration and international students play a role in that as much as university enrolments. But if we are serious and we do want to reach that low SES target, then it will require a government rethink to look at a targeted role for private providers, and ACR draw on the experience of opening up vet provision, and again probably opened too quickly, too fast here in Victoria. But what it did see was substantial increase in enrolments by Indigenous students, students with a disability, and those who'd left school without completing Year 12. So I think it's a debate that needs to be had, and certainly we're reaching, I guess, a similar conclusion to your own.
Not at all.
Is it too early for us to go to afternoon tea?
I did ask them to bring it forward
There's a question over here.
Hi, Kwong. Andrew Trounson at The Australian.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I'm good, thank you very much. Thanks for
Good.
asking. I was just wanted to follow up on what Claire was saying about, and what you were saying earlier about the low SES target. I want to clarify, are you in favour of retaining the low SES target? And is it something that the university sectors need to be continuing to focus on, or have we gone as far as we kind of go there?
Look, I think I'd answer by giving priority to a principle which says we do in this country have a tendency to chop and change very fast. And that target was certainly adopted by government in 2009, and it's a target that looks to 2020. I wouldn't want to be actually coming out and saying, as Bill did, let's drop it or let's leave it. Or I think, to be fair, what he said was that, is it still appropriate? And I think he said, no, it's not. Now, you could interpret that in different ways. I don't think we should be developing a mindset that says if we retain that target, we are encouraging parents, students and institutions to push into universities in inappropriate ways. I'm thinking of secondary schools. I'm thinking of year 11 and 12 students. I'm thinking in outer urban communities and in regional, rural communities of the schools that have year 11 and 12 students that are looking to where each of those students is most appropriately transfers after year 12 to the next step. And so I would be thinking, if the target is interpreted as ensuring that most of those students, if they don't have a better option, to be continuing their education beyond that stage, to be finding the most appropriate institution, to hope that the community and the government is willing to fund sufficiently to enable that to happen with that sort of target in mind, then I would be endorsing that strongly. But I'm not saying, look, universities should be scouring around and taking almost anyone and then saying, oh, look, you know, this hasn't really worked, or the student feeling disgruntled or disappointed and despondent and departing. I don't think we want that. I hope that's is that a fair enough answer, Andrew?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and saying, do you think that's happening at the moment, that there's been a lot of scouring going on and bringing in students too early, I suppose, is what you're saying?
I mean, I don't know a lot to be able to answer that, but what I do know is that the place to look to see what is happening in these particular communities, the areas that you were referring to, Sally, is go to the schools and find out what is happening in the schools and work from there as to what the right place and positioning should be. I think there's too much talk as if people leave year 12, that's finished, and then it's all open to how you go from there.
Sorry, Kwong, does that mean that you think the focus on low SES participation has been too much at the bachelor degree level, and that really the focus needs to be wider and at below that level of expanding opportunity?
Yeah, I think I can say that. You see, I think that the sector that I'd be most anxious about at this moment is not the university sector, but while you might put it in the broader terms and include the privates in it and talk the VET sector, I really worry about the government's responsibility for TAFE institutions. And I think that one of the things that we tend to say is that VET and higher education are parallels. They're both part of tertiary. Whereas if you look at the history of TAFE institutions have taken traditionally students from year 9 and 10 and year 11, as well as year 12 leavers, ever since the era when secondary technical schools, closed down. So I think the answer to your question, Andrew, is a simple yes. I think it would be better for a number of the students who are currently transitioning into year 1 of a university program to be taken more gently and more carefully. And they may well be in exactly that in another year's time. I think you've got one there. Yeah.
I really don't want to hog the microphone, but I'd really like to respond to that. I think this discussion that the low SES targets have a negative impact on standards is really very damaging. If you look at the, no, I know you didn't, but the suggestion, I mean, if you look at the quality of relationships that have been built up by universities, particularly such as my own, which I fully admit has an appalling record on low SES participation, the quality of the relationships that have been built up as a result of this push, it's very inspiring. We were talking to a person who works in Brewarrina the other day, a school of 350 kids, all Aboriginal kids. We asked him how many white kids there. He said, oh, they all go to boarding school. And they were full of pride for the fact that for the first time they had 12 people who'd reached year 12. 12 people. Now, I cannot believe for the life of me that that represents the true talent pool of that group. There's an enormous amount of wasted talent among disadvantaged education, and living in privileged urban areas, we just don't realise the depths of it. I know I was speaking to, when we first got a list of all the CAP and SSAF schools, I was talking to someone who's worked very closely on the UAC scaling for a long time, and she said there are schools on there I've never heard of, and you know why? I've never heard of them because not once in all the time I've been working with this organisation has a single student got an ATAR out of that. And that's the real tragedy. It would be just absurd, and I think obscene, if we abandoned this halfway through.
I think on that note, we might go for afternoon tea.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.